Okay, thank you. Yes, because I do need to have some support, some written support. I can't memorize all of this. So, good afternoon. My name is Zrinka Stahuljak. I'm director of the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, and I am very pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's talk. I also, before I say a few words about the program that this talk is a part of, I wanted to wish everyone a very happy new year, 2020. And in France, they have this grading system where 20 out of 20 is the best possible perfect mark you can get. And in English, we have this wonderful expression of 2020 vision, don't we? Which is perfect vision. So let us hope for a 2020 year. This afternoon's talk, is a part of a Distinguished Visiting Scholar series that we have had here at UCLA since 1998. And it hosts a group of distinguished speakers from around the world who come here to enrich our academic life at UCLA and, of course, to, in that way, further our research mission of a public university. Now, this program that has, in the past, when it first started, as I said, in 1998, invited well-established scholars, had been expanded in a few years back to also host early career researchers. So this is a wonderful and welcome change that was made a few years back at the suggestion of Matthew Fisher, professor in English. Now, what our guest lecturers do is they come and spend a week with us here at UCLA. They have a home department. They participate in different activities, and I'm very grateful to the English department who is hosting Professor Ed Putter for this week here at UCLA. The scholars are nominated by faculty members here at UCLA from departments across campus. And I am would like to mention, of course, with thanks to Professor Donka Minkova, who invited our guest speaker. Now, this wide reach of the speakers who come from all across the world and who are proposed, nominated from departments across campus, is then the reason also for the funding of the Distinguished Visiting Scholar Series that comes from the Humanities Division of the UCLA College of Letters and Sciences and the Armand Hammer Endowment for the UCLA Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. And if you would please join me in welcoming Professor Donka Minkova, who will introduce Ed Putter.
Yeah, it is a very special professional privilege to kind of say introductory accolades for our distinguished Anglo-Dutch visitor, and also a long-time professional associate, friend, also a devoted father, family cook, an avid biker, a hiker, enthusiastic hiker, a singer in 3 choirs, and lots of that, but most of all, a leading academic. So after chairing the English department at the University of Bristol, he is now director of the Center for Medieval Studies there, while also professing and researching at the English department and also at the Faculty of Arts Research Cluster at Bristol named Borders and Borderlands. And the most recent bright feather in his cap is a July 2019 award. He was elected Fellow of the British Academy. So what he did to deserve that very successful professional service is first 125 publications, and he's only mid-career. So that includes 5 authored or co-authored monographs. It includes 8 co-edited original collections. And I've seen a bunch of files in my Senate and administrative career in this university, and this is absolutely spectacular. So describing him as highly visible is an understatement. He has really been mind-bogglingly productive, and his expertise is not just in the number of just the bean counting. There's much more to it. It's very broad. He is truly border-crossing, and his work is a model of how different threads of the literary and linguistic heritage of the medieval world can be woven together into a solid conceptual fabric. So his earliest research placed him in the forefront of the academic cohort working on the Gawain poet. And he's got an Oxford University Press monograph now reprinted on that topic, well, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and a French Arthurian romance. And that book was described by modern philology as, quote, an extraordinarily informative and thought-provoking contribution to the study of Sir Gawain and the Chrétien de Troyes tradition that no serious student of medieval romance can afford to ignore. End of quote. His reputation as a leading expert on the Gawain poet was bolstered by two other books, an accessible introductory study of all four poems, and a collaborative edition of these poems in the prestigious Penguin English Poets series. The second area in which he is internationally recognized is his work on Middle English verse form. His 2007 co-authored monograph, Studies in the Meter of Alliterative Verse, is now a landmark accomplishment with lasting shelf life. He was the PI of an Arts and Humanities Research Council-funded project on the verse forms of Middle English romance, a project which I was very happily involved as a collaborator, and it resulted in widely cited journal articles and the 2018 collection named The Transmission of Medieval Romance Meters, Manuscripts, and Early Prints. He's currently writing the chapter on poetic forms for the medieval volume of the Oxford History of Poetry in English. There is yet another strand to his rich research fabric. Ed has always worked across different languages and literatures. He's equally at home in the Latin writings of Gerald of Wales, in Latin versification of the Bible, and in the French of medieval Britain. He's a prominent contributor to the critical appreciation and analytical study of multilingualism in medieval cultures, and his name is on books that have become foundational for that area, such as Language and Culture in Medieval Britain, the French of England, and Multilingualism in Medieval Britain. He's currently leading a collaborative research project funded by the Leverhulme Trust on the literary legacy of Anglo-Dutch relations, which crosses the chronological borders of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. We're really lucky to snatch him away for a week, so introductions are a tricky genre. You don't want to say too little, you want to be fair to the guest. On the other hand, you don't want to eat into their time. So to share his interest in medieval English multilingualism, Ed will now talk to us about William Caxton and multilingualism, the claims of French and Dutch, English and Kentish. So please join me in welcoming Professor Pater.
Thank you. Thank you, Donka, for those kind words, and very undeserved. And thank you also, Serenka, for your introduction. It's a real pleasure to be at your Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. And I hope, after that introduction, not to disappoint too much. So my topic is Caxton's multilingualism. And one of the wonderful things about research in our field now is that it has become much more conscious of the presence of other languages that played a part alongside Middle English, especially, of course, French and Latin. But there were a range of other languages involved. And one of the aims of my current research is to draw attention to the presence of those other languages, apart from the big three. I mean, the big three in England are French, Latin, English, of course, but then there were a host of other languages. And in the volume that I edited with Judith Jefferson, I drew attention to a host of other languages, Old Norse, Hebrew, Welsh, Cornish, Gaelic, and of course there was Dutch. And as Donker has already said, my current research is on the relationships between English speakers and Dutch speakers in the medieval and early modern period. The Low Countries were a crucial trading partner for England, so relations between English speakers and Dutch speakers were always very intense. And from the 14th century onwards especially, many Englishmen found it necessary or desirable to acquire Dutch. It is a well-kept secret that there is quite a lot of medieval Dutch which was written in England. Some of that has never been edited before, by scribes who were perfectly bilingual. And I will have an occasion to show you some of that in this lecture. But my main focus is William Caxton, and I'm going to give special attention to Caxton's prose. I think Caxton's importance will be known to anyone who's ever read any books on the history of the English language. Here Caxton usually features as the man who brought printing to England, the first English printer, and who played a leading role in the standardization of the English language. And a representative example, I dare call it the Caxton myth. I think it is to some extent a myth. Is this account? It's a very lively book, and I thoroughly recommend it. Prior to the development of standard written English, there was much variation in writing. In the 15th century, William Caxton was keenly aware of this issue. Caxton's wish for some kind of standard had an economic dimension. Clearly, it would be very costly to print a different version of a book for every variety of English, so Caxton needed to pick a variety of English, one variety of English that was widely understood and was socially valued and thus would be taken seriously. Now, there is obviously some truth in this. Caxton was very conscious of the existence of different dialects in England. So I dare say was anyone who travelled in medieval England. You would be conscious of differences between dialects. But it's not very plausible to think that he was at liberty to pick a variety of English. It's much more likely that the variety of English that he wrote was based on the variety of English that he spoke. And that variety, this is one of the, I suppose, the theme of my lecture, that variety was actually rather eccentric. And the reason it was so eccentric is that it was so deeply influenced by the other languages that Caxton spoke and wrote, namely Dutch and French. And it's this multilingual Caxton who I'm going to be examining, who will we be examining in this lecture. So to begin, at the start of this lecture, I think we ought to replace our image of Caxton as the inventor of English printing with a less insular image. Caxton did introduce printing into England, but we should also appreciate Caxton as a pioneer of printing in the Low Countries, where Caxton spent the best part of his working life. Let me just give you a little bit of historical background to Caxton. In his late teens, he was apprenticed to Robert Large, the Mayor of London. Sometime after the Mayor's death in 1441, Caxton left England for Flanders, where he rose to become governor of the English nation. And what that really means is that he was the head of the corporation of English merchants who have their headquarters in Bruges, because if you were trading in cloth, that's where you wanted to be. The Low Countries was the place where the best cloth was made. So if you had headquarters in cloth making, cloth was the oil of the medieval period. These merchants had their headquarters in Bruges, and Caxton was the head of that company of merchants. In 1471 to 1472, he was in Cologne, where he got his first taste of printing by collaborating on an edition of the Latin Encyclopedia De Proprietatibus Rerum, on the order of things, by Bartholomew the Englishman. Caxton's disciple, and probably his assistant, Wynkyn de Worde, remembered Caxton's venture in Cologne, and he wrote about it in his English language edition of that same Latin encyclopedia, where he has just 4 lines of verse. And also of your charité culto remembrance, the soul of William Caxton, first printer of this book, in Latin tongue, at Cologne, himself t'avance, that every well-disposed man may thereon look. So according to Wynkyn, Caxton's motivation in printing this work, or in helping to print this work, this Latin text, was to advance himself, to develop himself, I guess that means, as a printer. In Cologne, he was able to learn from the best, including the experienced printer Ulrich Zell, and the master of typography of this period, whose name is Johann Weldener, who developed the first types for Caxton's books. And he followed Caxton to the Low Countries after his stay in Cologne. Caxton then was introduced to printing well before the first dated book was produced in the Low Countries. He was a pioneer of printing, not in England in the first instance, he was a pioneer of printing in the Low Countries. Caxton published the first printed book in English, that's the Recueil of the Histories of Troy, probably in Ghent in 1473. It was dedicated and presented to Margaret of York, the wife of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, who resided in Ghent for most of 1473 and 1474. I have here a little slide to show you the printing type of that first book printed in English, but printed in the Low Countries, which, according to the great expert on these matters, Lotte Hellinga, was modelled on the Burgundian script of the scribe David Aubert. And I have for you here a manuscript that was copied, that was written by Aubert in Ghent. And there are some striking similarities between the frontispiece of Caxton's Recueil and the portrait of Margaret of York in the manuscript produced by David Aubert in Ghent. First, and I've circled this in red here, there is the motif of the man lurking in the margins. There he is. That probably represents Charles the Bold. The reality of the situation is that Charles the Bold was much less interested in books than his wife, Margaret of York. But the artists from the period thought it was tactful to acknowledge the influence of the man behind the scenes. And their solution was to represent Charles the Bold in in a kind of marginal positions. Here he is looking right at the back of the church. This is, by the way, is Margaret of York herself, kneeling and reading her, presumably, a book of hours. And here he is, Charles the Bold. And there are some other similarities too. There is, of course, the striking similarities. Not the man in the hat. There he is. That's, if you remember, that's Charles the Bold here. But if you compare that image with that man there we are, holding his hat, his hand on his hip, there are striking similarities, and it's really on the basis of these similarities, both on the basis of the printing type, and the similarities there between the frontispiece of the Recueil and the manuscripts produced by David Aubert, that first printed book of England has been placed in Ghent. If you look it up in Wikipedia, you'll see Bruges. But Wikipedia is not to be trusted on quite a few matters, and that's one of them. The dating of Caxton's Low Countries editions is uncertain, but it seems that his next printed book was a French language version of the same text. The Recueil des Histoires Troyennes, probably published in Ghent in 1474. That French text, Caxton's French Recueil, is just as groundbreaking as his English equivalent. Setting aside a fragment of a translation of Donatus's Ars Minor, which is undated and unattributed, it's a fragment that has been dated to roughly 1470, that was printed in Holland. Caxton's Recueil is actually the first French book to be printed. The first dated French language book from France is the Légende dorée, the Golden Legend, printed in Lyon by Guillaume Leroy in 1476. So he was a pioneer in printing, both English and French. He collaborated in the Low Countries. You had to collaborate. One of the issues as a printer is that any art, any craft that involved skill required you to be a member of a guild. And so Caxton had to collaborate with local guild members. He collaborated with Aubert. He also collaborated with Mencion. And he built up, as a result of having to collaborate, an excellent network of contacts. And these contacts he kept going even when he returned to England. And I've got two examples of these Low Countries networks from after Caxton's return to England. One of these is this is the image that you'll recognise from the poster. This is the Caxton, the so-called Caxton Master. This is an artist who illustrated the mirror of the world. It's a didactic treatise, and he was the style of the drawings closely matched those of book art from Utrecht. From the 1460s, and it's actually very likely that Caxton met this artist in Utrecht because he was out there in the 1460s. And on the right hand there, another instance where Wikipedia needs to be corrected, is the man Wynkyn de Worde. Wynkyn was the successor of Caxton. Wynkyn moved the press from Westminster to Fleet Street. He's widely said to be a German, but that's almost certainly incorrect. He was probably a Dutchman. De Worde is the place name Woerden in Holland, and that way he was probably from. And the type, the printing type used by Wynkyn, here we are, that's based on books printed in Gouda. So Wynkyn had Dutch connections, and Wynkyn was Caxton's assistant. So these are the Dutch connections that Caxton built up in the Low Countries and took with him when he took the printing press to the Netherlands. So I think we've now made the first step in broadening our vision of Caxton. He was a pioneer of not just of English printing, but of printing in the Low Countries, in English and in French. And the idea of him as the man who set about standardizing the English language can usefully be replaced with a different perspective. This is Anne Calderon's description of Caxton as a man without borders. What she writes is the first book printed in English was not printed in England. William Caxton Englished the Recueil of the Histories of Troy from the French, and he printed it in Bruges. That's probably wrong, it's probably Ghent, in 1473. What did it mean to English a book? The verb to English simply meant to translate into English. But the actual practice of Englishing involved much more than verbal translation. The Recueil, like so many other early printed books, came from a French language-mediated medieval work and was produced by a bilingual printer-translator using continental technology, typefaces, paper and book design. Not only the literary text, but also the materials and methods of its production were foreign and underwent processes of acculturation. In this, the Recueil is no anomaly, no quirky experimental exile. Its francophone Burgundian origins instead signal a crucial characteristic of early modern English literary culture, a constitutive foreignness established in translation, transformed by a new technology, and perpetuated in reprints. This is a useful step, I think, in seeing Caxton as more in a broader European context. We do, however, need to take one more step, and a step further than Calderon, who I think rather overdoes the francophone element. And I have another example of this. English-born Caxton was a polyglot cultural amphibian who worked in the Low Countries and francophone Bruges for during some formative years. A majority of his production was translated from French. I hope some of you have had the chance to visit Bruges, and if you haven't, I hope you will, or the beautiful Ghent. Now, if you visit these places, you will realize that they're not francophone at all. They are Dutch-speaking, and they were Dutch-speaking when Caxton was there. It is certainly true that under the Burgundian rulers, an attempt was made to impose French as the language of official communication. The Burgundian dukes were French-speaking, but the attempt to impose the French language had only very limited success. It worked as far as communication between government and the dukes was concerned, but all local administration in the Low Countries was carried on in Dutch, and also communication between the different principalities of the Low Countries continued in Dutch. It is also the case that the Dukes of Burgundy, being shrewd politicians, realized it was very important that they should know and that their children should know the language of the people that they governed. So in the 14th century, Philip the Bold made sure that all his children could speak Flemish. I am in this lecture, I should explain, using Dutch and Flemish as equivalents. I can explain later, but I won't go into detail here. The role of the duchesses was very interesting too. It was the expected role of the consort, that she should be able to act as a mediator between the people and the ruler. So it was especially important for female rulers to know and speak the language of the people. This included duchesses who were native English speakers. And I have two examples of this. Here's an early one. Duke John II of Brabant married Margaret of England, who was a daughter of Edward I, and to celebrate the bond, the Middle Dutch poet Jan van Heelu dedicated a verse chronicle about the history of Brabant to Margaret. I'll read it in the Dutch for a bit of colour, but there is a translation underneath. Vrouwe Margriete van Engeland, die zeker heeft van Brabant, zegt hogen Jans zone Jan. Want sie Dietse talen nieten kan. Daarbij wil ik haar ene gichte zinden van Dietse gedichten, daar sie Diets in moren legen. In other words, this chronicle was sent to her so that she could learn the language. More remarkable still is Margaret of York. I've mentioned her. Margaret of York was the celebrity. This was the celebrity marriage of the 15th century, the marriage between Margaret of York and Charles the Bold. Margaret of York was a native English speaker, but we know that she mastered Dutch. And we know this because when Charles the Bold's daughter, Mary of Burgundy, married Maximilian of Austria, the future German emperor, Maximilian took up Dutch, since, he said, a prince ought to know the language of his subjects, and remarkably he reveals that the person who taught him Dutch was Margaret of York. Amazing. So, one of the languages we need to put into the mix here, especially when we're speaking of Caxton, is Dutch. And there are many indications that it was for Caxton and the English merchants who were stationed in Bruges the main language they had to contend with. It's clear to some extent from what Caxton himself says about his language. In the prologue to the Recueil of the Histories of Troy, he apologizes for the simpleness and unperfectness that I had in both languages. That is to wit, in French and in English. For in France was I never, and learned my English in Kent, in the Weald, where I doubt not is spoken as broad and rude English as in any place of England, and have continued by the space of 30 years, for the most part in the countries of Brabant, Flanders, Holland, and Zealand. Now, medieval authors liked to make apologies for their language, and it would be naive to take this completely at face value, but this rhetorical ploy would have backfired completely if what he'd said here was implausible. There is, for example, absolutely no reason to doubt that he was from Kent. He was born in the Weald. There are different places in Kent that make a claim to being the birthplace of Caxton. So his exact birthplace remains disputed. And what he says about his stay for many years in different parts of the Low Countries can also be verified from his life records. All these counties he mentions, he visited. He says he never went to France. And initially I thought that was wrong, because we have records of him being spending 3 years in Calais, the wool staple there. But of course Calais was at that stage an English colony. It was owned by England. And the other thing that's worth knowing about Calais, I put here a map of northeast France. And you can see there is Calais, and that's where we know Caxton spent a few years. That's where the wool staple was based. And we think of Calais now, of course, we think of France as French-speaking. But the fascinating thing about the medieval period is that for the 14th century, I've got you here, this line here, there it goes. That's the language border, as it was in the 14th century, right? Between the French-speaking region down here and the Dutch-speaking region up here. you can actually tell from the place names that this was historically Dutch-speaking. And the reason I mention this is that for the centuries in which Calais was an English colony, that's roughly 1350 to 1550, England had a hard language border onto Dutch-speaking countries. This area was Dutch-speaking. In the circles of merchants, the mercers, the drapers, the wool merchants, I would say that in the 15th century it was more important to know Dutch than French. Alison Hannam, in her edition of the Seeley Letters, writes that French was a desirable accomplishment in any educated person, but for a merchant with dealings in Calais or in Bruges, it was Flemish that was essential. That's an interesting hierarchy of usefulness, which is not perhaps the one we expect. Dutch first and then French second. That's not the same, of course, as the hierarchy of prestige. In terms of the hierarchy of prestige, of course, French was more prestigious than Dutch. But in terms of usefulness, Dutch was crucial if you were dealing in cloth. And in the second part of the lecture, I'm going to now take a closer look at Caxton's English. I think I can find some evidence that after 30 years in the Low Countries, Caxton's English was indeed becoming a little rusty. My main sources are going to be his translations from Dutch. Calderon has already mentioned that he did a lot of translating from French, but the fascinating thing about Caxton is that he also translated from Dutch. There is the history of Reinhard the Fox. Now that work needs to be very well known in UCLA, because as Professor Andy Kelly has mentioned to me, your Bruin, the bear, is actually a character in Caxton's history of Reinhard the Fox, so go off and read it. And then there's the dialogues in French and English, which was also translated by Caxton from the Dutch. Now, the English in these texts is really a little peculiar. So, and I've given you here a sample of Caxton's prose. A little sentence there from Caxton. If the fox will tell how it befell, I will give him the foredeal thereof. For I cannot tell it so well, but he shall berisp me. Now there are two words which have disappeared completely from the English language. There is this one here, foredeal, and there is this one here, berisp me. I don't know if I have any Dutch speakers in the audience here. If there are Dutch speakers, they will have no difficulty with these words because they are taken from Dutch. Berisp is from the Dutch verb berispen. It means to reprimand or to reproach. And then the word foredeal comes from Dutch, voordeel. The standard explanation for the oddities of Caxton's English is that he was a man in a hurry and was just translating the Dutch literally. This is the great Norman Blake, who did the edition of Reinhard the Fox in the early English Text Society. He did try to translate the Dutch into current 15th century English. Sometimes he fails to achieve this and takes over the Dutch constructions literally. These lapses arose from the haste with which he executed the work. Again, there is some truth in this. For example, our word berisp, that one there, that's taken over from the source text. He just lifts it from the Dutch texts and transliterates it into English. But the fascinating thing is that the word foredeal is not in the Dutch source. The Dutch source has a different word altogether. It has voorwaarde. And Caxton didn't import it because he was busy, because he was hastily translated. He put it in because he had Dutch hardwired into his brain. This also explains why some of these Dutch words crop up in texts that are not translated from the Dutch at all. Perhaps the best known work of Caxton is his edition of Malory's Maud Arthur, that great Arthurian cycle. And if you read his edition of Malory, you will find that he puts words in that are not in Malory at all, but that come from his own mind. Here's an example. Thus the battle was great, and oft-sides that one party was at a foredeal, and one at an afterdeal. One was at an advantage, and the other one was at a disadvantage. It cannot be said that these Dutch words here come in because he's working, hastily translating a Dutch source. They come in because the man was often thinking in Dutch. So I think we need to replace our notion of Caxton as a hasty translator with the image of a man who was a bilingual Dutch-English speaker, and who had what linguists would probably call interference from one language when he worked in another. There are many other instances where Caxton produces Dutch-inflected English in his Reinaard, without prompting by his source. And an examination of some of these instances suggests to me that the influence of Dutch on English has actually been underreported in our historical dictionary. A very interesting case is the idiom to give over, which I've given you an example there of Caxton using it. He hath left and given over his castle Malpradus, which you might translate as he has left and he has surrendered or handed over. I suppose the idiom now would be hand over in modern English, or to give up. Give over. This is not in Caxton's source, which has simply the verb to give, begeven. And I ask myself where it comes from. It's not really very Middle English. In Middle English, you would normally just say give, not to give over. And when I looked this up in the OED, I find that the first attestations for it are all Caxton by some way. There he is, 1483. They obviously didn't spot the one in the Reinaard, which is 1481. From the Golden Legend, he gave himself all over unto our Lord Jesus Christ. And here again, 1481, the Turks were discomfited and gave over the towers. Whether Caxton actually was the first man to use the phrase may be doubted. I have found an earlier attestation in 1480. It's a charter. It was translated from Dutch to English. As to for this time have been made certain requests, and in writing have been given over to us. Translated from the Dutch. Alzo voormaals zekere begeerten gedaan en met geschriften overgegeven zijn geweest. Very likely, I think, that particular idiom, to give over, was influenced by Dutch. There's a copy, by the way, of this charter which I just read out to you, which I recently had a chance to examine in the Mercers Guild. They still have a wonderful library collection. You have to go to the Mercers. And this is a wonderful book. It was copied in 1484 probably by an English scribe in a Burgundian-style script, and it's written in 4 languages. Hooray! Multilingual Britain. It's written in Latin, French, Dutch, and English. So, trying to move here beyond the idea of Caxton as a lazy translator who simply moved Dutch from his source into his English. To move beyond that, we need to also cast our net broader. We've so far looked at some loan words that were carried across from Dutch to English. But we need to consider, as you would when you think about interference, if you are bilingual and you have 2 languages, interference is going to affect not only your word choice, it's going to affect all levels of language. Phonology, spelling, grammar. Now, some of this we see in his translations from the Dutch, that the spellings are sometimes a little odd. Very interesting is the use of V for F. So, to fall, you would expect that to be spelt with an F. But Caxton spells the word trapdoor sometimes with a V. And he has the word flitch, but he sometimes spells that with a V. You would expect him to spell Middle English O with an O, or perhaps 2 O's, but Caxton often spells it with OE. What's going on here? Well, I won't have to tell you what Blake thinks. Blake thinks it's hasty translation. There we are. Many of the spelling variations, however, such as behoefvol. Actually, there are 2 issues here. On the one hand, there's the spelling of O. This would be normally spelled with an O by Caxton, or with 2 O's, as O-O-E. But also, you would expect, in his spelling, you would expect that to be a V, which he spells as an F. And he thinks that these have been introduced from the Dutch through a too hasty translation on Caxton's part. Well, the really interesting thing is that those same oddities can be found in texts that Caxton was translating from French. And I've given you here a few examples. The history of Jason, that's the story of Jason and the golden fleece. As you expect, the word fleece is going to crop up quite a lot in that text. It is always spelled, as you might expect, to have to be spelled with an F. But then twice in the history of Jason, printed in the Low Countries, he spells it with a V in Dutch style, vlieze. Stepmother, normally spelled by Caxton with as you might expect, like this, stepmoeder in Middle English. But in his recueil, printed in Ghent in 1473, he spells it stiefmoeder, which is basically a Dutch spelling. That strange behoefet that Blake didn't like also occurs in the recueil once. Friend, always spelled like that in Caxton, but once in the recueil in the Dutch spelling with IE. So what I'm arguing here is that some of the peculiarities which are clearly based on Dutch can be found in works when he's translating not from Dutch but when he's translating from French. Loan words too crop up, Dutch loan words, in works that are translating from French. So the word butter, from Dutch botter, meaning a cheat, very useful word. It is used in the game and play of the chess, printed in Bruges 1474. Spinrock, distaff, crops up, Dutch loanword in the Book of the Knight of the Tower. Spinkop, spider, which is apparently a Flemish word. I'm reliably told by Flemish speakers that word is still used in dialects of Flanders. That is used in 3 of Caxton's French translations. One that hasn't been noticed, and which I'm rather fond of, in the OED, is the word gulp. That's a Dutch borrowing, gulp. And this is the OED entry, our word, a gulp. But the person who first used it isn't in 1568. It is actually Caxton. In his work printed in Ghent, he would at one gulp have engluted or swallowed him in. So attending to some of those words can restore gaps in dictionaries. It can also help editors. There's a very difficult reading in Caxton's translation from of the French Ovid de Moralisé. It runs like this: I ocht wel den bedwingen mijn hert. And Richard Mole, who edited this recently, could do nothing with that word, bedwinger, apart from emend it to bend. Because the French source has bien on doit mon cœur fléchir. Now, fléchir can mean bend, but it cannot mean bend here in context. You can't bend your heart. The word fléchir simply here means to control, which is also what the word bedwingen means in Dutch. And Caxton used it elsewhere in the Reinaard when he was translating from the Dutch. I shall bedwingen and subdue thee. So, to me, there's no doubt about it. That word there, bedwingen, is authentic. It should not be amended. It's interference from Caxton's Dutch. Grammatical interference. I've mentioned lexis, I've mentioned spelling. I'd like to say something about grammar. The most perceptive remark about some of Caxton's grammar comes from Henry Bradley's edition of Caxton's dialogues in French and English. Bradley is the man who took over the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary. And he noticed something odd about Caxton's translation of the French. Ce n'est mis le dernier argent que vous aurez de moi, which Caxton translates as, it and is not the last silver that you shall have of me. This N is really very, very odd. It's not odd if you think in Dutch, because in Dutch, N is the particle you use with not. And the note by Bradley is spot on, I think. He says, it and is not is Flemish, het and is niet. Evidently, when this was written, Caxton had become more familiar with Flemish than with his native language. Well, I needn't remind you that actually Caxton says something like that in his prologue when he says, I'm no longer perfect in French and English because I've lived in these foreign parts for 30 years. And I'll notice that a grammatical interference is Caxton's use of the verb to beleven. It means to remain in Middle English. Now, in Middle English, this is a weak verb. That's to say, it forms its past tense by adding a T or a D. So in normal Middle English, and actually that's true for Caxton too, if you have the verb belave and you want to put it in the past tense, you would say belaved or beloved. Those are your possibilities. But then when Caxton prints works in Flanders, he does something very odd. It becomes a strong verb. I've put some examples on the handout, on the PowerPoint. Many have gone thither that been there left, and bleven, they have remained there. And of the party of Jason there bleef no more than twine, not be lavered, not be laughed. He treats it here as a strong verb. And he does that only in one other place, and that is in Reinhard, which he's translating from the Dutch. In the Thorpe, there ne bleef neither man ne wief. And the Dutch source here has bleef, because in Dutch, that's a strong verb. So interference in vocabulary, also interference in grammar. Probably also in two old present participles. Now, in Middle English, certainly by the 15th century, the present participle you expect is ing, is the one we still have. I am going. Only twice does Caxton use something that is a little anomalous by this period, a present participle in inde. This has been explained as being due to his Kentish dialect. You remember he said he was born in Kent. Now, in the south, up till about 1350, you can certainly find present participles in inde and in ende. This was the southern form of the present participle. But I doubt very much that that is the explanation for these forms in the recueil. The explanation here is Dutch, because in Flemish your present participle was formed by the suffix nde. So very likely to be Dutch. Now it's time for some conclusions. What can we conclude? First, I think that Dutch was rather more important to English speakers of the 14th and 15th century than current work on multilingual England would suggest. Its importance, I think, increased as the medieval period progressed. And that's partly a reflection of economic realities, particularly the cloth trade and the wool trade. Second conclusion, Caxton was himself fluent in Dutch. And some of the peculiarities of his language are explicable if we think of him as a bilingual Dutch-English speaker. Of course, bilingual is a simplification because he also had French. He also translated some stuff from Latin. There he made mistakes, by the way, in Latin. The influence of Dutch on Caxton is most obvious, as you would expect, when he is translating from Dutch. So you see it above all in the history of Reinhard the Fox and in the dialogues. But there is evidence of linguistic interference from Dutch in his other works. And some of those are translations from French or adaptations of Mallory's English. They cannot then be the work of a hasty translator. That language wasn't contracted from the source, like some kind of acute disease which you get when you're translating from Dutch. This was a chronic condition that was hardwired into his brain. And then the final thing is, it seems very odd to me from this perspective that Caxton should be held up in textbooks of the English language as the man who standardized English. His English really was rather peculiar, much stranger than you would think. So the myth of Caxton as the man who standardized English needs to be substituted by scholarship that recognises his multilingualism. Thank you for your attention.